And Jesus is coming out of the city of Jericho with his disciples and a large crowd. Bartimaeus, which means the son of Timaeus, and some commentators think that Timaeus means a blind man, is a blind beggar, so you have the blind son of a blind man, perhaps, sitting at his regular spot at the gate of the city, begging, a blind beggar. Two afflictions of the human lot, either of which would terrify us: to be absolutely destitute on the street with nothing, and to be blind. And he's doing his usual thing when he hears a commotion, and he asks, who's there, what's happening, who's coming into town or leaving town, and they say it's Jesus of Nazareth. And he cries out, Jesus, Son of David, have pity on me. And quite evidently, he's not just saying this under his breath, he is shouting it at the top of his voice. And the people around him tell him to shut up, to hold his tongue. He has no right to make more commotion. He's the lowest of the low. He shouldn't be heard. He shouldn't even be seen. But he continues to cry out, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And Jesus, who always hears the individual in the crowd and is not interested in crowds or public opinion surveys, he's not a politician. He's not interested in numbers. So Jesus is not interested in numbers. And he can handle a crowd, but he's not dependent on the crowd. There's no codependent relationship between the crowd and Jesus as there is in the case of politicians. So he always hears the person in the crowd. And he calls for this blind beggar to be brought to him. He hears in this cry something of that appeal for the gift that it is in Jesus' own nature always to give, to want to give. And the blind beggar comes, and there's no long conversation. It's a very short exchange, very direct, because perhaps Jesus has heard in that quality of the cry of the beggar the authenticity of the appeal. And he says, what do you want me to do for you? Very direct and personal, as Jesus always is. And the blind man says, Rabbi, teacher, I want my sight back. And Jesus replies, go, your faith has healed you. And at once he recovered his sight and followed him on the road. Now, how do we see that healing story in relationship to the previous one of the rich young man? What is the difference between them? One is poor, one is rich. One can see, one is in full control of his faculties, of his life energy, and the other one is blind, handicapped, poor, marginal, having no status, no respect from people around him. But another difference between them is that the blind beggar, Bartimaeus, knows what he wants. He has self-knowledge, which the rich young man quite painfully and drastically lacked. He didn't know what he wanted, and he didn't yet have much self-knowledge. And it is this capacity for self-knowledge and to be in touch with your deepest desire that enables this connection to work. He picks up the signal, and there is a communication. There is live contact. The green light goes on. It works between Jesus and Bartimaeus. And the gift can flow. It can be exchanged because he knows what he wants and he is open to it and he is empty enough to receive it. He is poor in spirit, as I said. And he has the treasure in heaven that Jesus promised the rich young man, which he couldn't quite get his head around at that time. And so this question of following Jesus then doesn't even come up as a particular issue. It just happens. He gets up, his faith has healed him. Faith is always about relationship, not belief. It's this living personal relationship with Jesus that has healed him. And he then follows him on the road. He has become a true disciple. He has found his true self. The ego never wants to be a disciple. The ego always wants to be the teacher, the boss, the number one, the person in charge. The ego never wants to learn in the role of a disciple, unless the ego has become diminished enough, reduced enough, and empty enough to be able to see what discipleship really means. Discipleship, the following of Jesus, is not a destruction of the self, but a gift of self. It's the context in which this total gift of being can be fully accepted and developed. So we put these two stories together. If you were a film director, you might be clever enough to have the same actor play both the rich young man and the blind beggar. And the gap in between would be a whole trilogy of what happened to the rich young man after his initial encounter with the gift and his inability to receive the gift, but the progressive influence of the encounter with the offer of the gift on him until eventually he became empty enough and poor enough and humble enough and real enough to be able to accept it. And that's our life's journey, perhaps. And our meditation is that journey, lived out in our hearts every time we sit to meditate, morning and evening, day by day. That is the journey we are making. From the incapacity of the ego to receive the gift to the potential of emptiness, of poverty, to be one with the gift. That's our journey of meditation. And the path, we make this transformative journey in. This is why we say meditation changes our life. That path is the mantra. And the mantra is a narrow little path that leads to life, leads to the gift of life. It's narrow in the sense that it is the work of attention. If you pay attention, you're narrowing your consciousness on a single point. It takes faith to realize and experience then, to realize that the narrower the focus, the broader the range of your consciousness becomes. The more your heart opens. But it's a narrow and little path. It's a little work. It's not dramatic. It is particular. You say the mantra, or you try to say the mantra, or you don't. It's a choice, in a sense. And it is an act of attention. It is an act of love. It is an act of faith. Not something we're thinking about or theorizing about, but something at a certain moment we actually do when we sit to meditate. That's the immediacy of it. That's why it gives us this sense of being fully present.